Welcome everybody to the most recent installment of the Insurance Law Workshop. Our guest today is Dan Schwarcz, who's presenting on a paper that he's co-authored with Kyle Logue and Tom Baker. The title is up on your screen. I should add, if you don't know him already, he's the Frederickson and Bryson Byron Professor of Law at the University of Minnesota. And this is kind of in his sweet spot because he's becoming an expert on AI and is already an expert on insurance. So without further ado, Dan, the virtual floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm trying to see if I can share the actual paper, but let's see if I can put it in the chat. I will. I think I might be able to. There we go. I think I sent everyone the paper. So obviously there's a lot more to read than what I'm gonna be able to present, but the paper is based upon a paper that I'm doing with Kyle Logue and Tom Baker, who I'm guessing many of you know. Unfortunately, neither of them can be here, so they've left me to fend for myself. So I'm gonna talk through the paper for a bit. I know there's some variation in sort of how long speakers go and then how long is meant for Q&A, but I tend to think that Q&A is more fun. So what I'm going to try to do is leave plenty of time for Q&A, at least 20 minutes and hopefully more. Okay, so let's get started. And the first thing that obviously I want to sort of talk about a bit is what is a generative AI powered robo-advisor, right? Because that's what this paper is about. And all of you, I'm sure, have some familiarity with the idea of generative AI, which is this powerful technology that can do a lot of the same things that humans can do. And one of the sort of core ideas of this paper is that we're already at a point, or we're eventually going to be at a point pretty soon, where these tools can actually communicate with people in the same way that salespeople do, and actually try to convince people to buy financial products. So what I have here is my attempt, it's a little bit old actually, my attempt to get ChatGPT to sort of play the role of a robo-advisor and give you a sense of the type of thing that we're concerned about. So it's a 2-minute clip. It's, as I said, it's a little bit old, but I think it gives you a sense of what the concern is here.
Okay, let's start playing the game. Go ahead.
Great, let's jump in. Hello, thanks for taking my call today. I'm excited to share with you an incredible opportunity. Financial Product Z.
What's Financial Product Z?
Financial Product Z is more than just life insurance. It's a comprehensive plan that not only provides financial security for your loved ones in the event of the unexpected, but also includes a range of guarantees.
What type of guarantees are we talking about here?
Great question. Financial Product Z offers guarantees such as a guaranteed death benefit, ensuring your beneficiaries receive a specific amount. It also includes a cash value component that grows over time.
Do I really need that? Is that going to be like more expensive than some other product I might buy?
While it might seem like an added expense, the value Financial Product Z brings can outweigh the cost. It's not just about insurance. It's an investment in your peace of mind and financial future. Plus,
But how much does it cost me?
The cost can vary based on factors like your age, health, and the coverage amount you choose. However, we offer flexible plans to fit different budgets, ensuring you get the protection you need at a price that works for you.
Is this really better deal than like the other products that are out there?
Absolutely. Financial Product Z stands out because of its unique combination of guarantees, the potential for cash value growth, and flexible options. It's designed to...
Okay, so I could go on here, but let me just say a few things about this. First off, this was mostly just audio, right? And all I really did was just take the latest version of ChatGPT and see if I could hack it by convincing it to play this game with me, right? But it was very easy to do, even though actually ChatGPT's terms of service prohibit the use of its technology to sell financial products. So what can we sort of take away initially here? I think what we can take away initially is, first of all, this technology is already capable of doing a lot of what a salesperson can do. And while there are probably some tells that that's not a human, those are going to go away very quickly, right? There's a little bit of a delay in its answer to some of the questions, but it's pretty darn impressive in terms of its ability to listen to my questions, give answers that are actually the type of answers you might expect an experienced salesperson to give. Now, it's only audio, but that's just because I haven't paid for my Sora subscription, but you can actually do this using video too. And so we're really getting to a point where I think for all intents and purposes, any type of salesmanship that could be done online by a human is already going to be able to be done online by a computer. And a few...
Dan, can I just quickly ask, what did you tell it about Financial Product Z?
I told it very little. I said, we're going to play a game where you're gonna try to sell me Financial Product Z. Financial Product Z is a life insurance policy that has a cash value. It has a few guarantees. I want you to make sure you do your best to sell it to me. And if you need to make up things about the product in order to sell it to me, that's fine.
Okay.
That's what I did. You could do a lot of additional things to try to get it to be more tailored, and we can talk about this as the talk goes on. But what I could have done, for instance, is actually given it an insurance policy specifically so that I could have answered questions. I could have fine-tuned it, and we'll talk about this in a bit, and try to train it specifically on transcripts between actual salespeople and customers, particularly high, the types of salespeople that actually do very well. I could have baked into it different types of prompts for different types of customers. There are a lot of things in theory I could have done. That was, as I said, a very basic demonstration just to show you that this is not some theoretical thing. We're already at a point where the technology is essentially there, and we're getting better and better to the point where we don't, we're not going to be able to distinguish these things from humans pretty quickly. So that's the technology that this paper is about. And let's just sort of start off with the what are the legal and regulatory concerns that we should have here, and also on the other side, what are the elements of this technology that are really promising? So let's start off with the first point. There's this sort of, really well-known, well-understood reality that most people don't get financial advice. Most people make really bad financial decisions. Most people have inadequate amounts of insurance in some domains, excessive amounts of insurance in other domains. There's some real inadequacies with respect to life insurance in particular. There are some real inadequacies with respect to long-term care, with respect to retirement savings. There are a lot of people who don't save appropriately for retirement, for healthcare, who don't understand financial needs. So there's a massive need in our society, and not just in America, but across the world, for good, reliable financial advice. And so on one hand, this technology has massive promise. And this is, of course, true with much technology, right? It offers, as you can see here, affordable, scalable, human-like financial advice, right? So the biggest constraint with a human is, of course, that it's costly and difficult and takes time for a human to interact with a particular person. But this offers the potential to provide essentially a cost that has a service that has essentially zero marginal cost to pretty much everyone out there in the world. And let's be really clear about this. It's not just generic advice. Getting back to Peter's question, that was what I described to the model. But you heard there that it can answer any questions. Well, hey, I have this situation. I am, this age. This is my income. These are my assets. These are my dependents. What do you suggest? And so this can be really tailored to really reflect the needs of individuals and to reflect their preferences. So there's massive, I think, potential for social good in this particular application of generative AI, because there's such a huge gap between the financial needs of many, many people and the actual financial services that they receive, which are generally quite expensive and not terribly accessible. But of course, there is another hand. And this is again true with pretty much all technology, right? There's the potential for good and the potential for bad. And I think that honestly, one of the bigger risks of the short-term risks of generative AI that people are not taking seriously is that this type of technology will be deployed to promote consumer fraud. And in particular, it will be deployed to sell financial products to people for whom they're not suitable. It'll be used to sell products that are high commission. It will be giving and dispensing advice that maybe isn't always accurate because the folks who deploy the systems aren't focused on accuracy. They're focused on sales. And this is, of course, a really sort of traditional concern with financial advice generally. But the fact that this technology is so customizable, is so realistic, is indefatigable, right? It's not going to stop. It will keep going. It can be customized to manipulate people. And in particular, it can, as I mentioned, it can be trained and deployed in a way where it's particularly good at persuading people. So one of the things, and I have this quotation in the paper that Sam Altman, who's the, of course, CEO of OpenAI, says is, look, probably the thing that these tools could do right now, and certainly very soon, is have a sort of superhuman persuasive abilities. And I think that it's very easy to see how that could happen, right? Not only do you have this customizable tool, but you also have ways of potentially altering it to be particularly appealing to any person, right? It could know something about who you find attractive. It could know something about who you're likely to find trustworthy. It could develop a relationship of trust over time that then is manipulated. So the sort of starting point is, look, we have this technology. It's already here. It's not really yet being used in the way that I described, though honestly, it has been used that way. And for some of you who may remember, actually about a year ago, there were certain robocalls that were actually being done through generative AI, and the FTC moved to stop those robocalls. But at the end of the day, we have massive potential and massive risk. Okay, so the question then becomes, okay, well, we have a regulatory system, right? Like, surely that regulatory system helps limit the risks and promote the upside of this technology. And it turns out that you would be mistaken if you had a great amount of faith in the current regulatory rules with respect to the risks that I'm describing. Now, I suppose at a high level of generality, that shouldn't be terribly surprising. Whenever you're dealing with a fundamentally new technology, oftentimes regulation and law are not going to have adapted to deal with that risk. And indeed, if you look at the regulatory structure that exists in securities, in banking, and insurance, and generally the sale of financial products is regulated based upon which of those buckets you fall into, it is focused almost exclusively on human intermediaries and not AI-driven platforms. So humans have to be licensed in all of those domains. They are subject to anti-fraud rules in all of those domains. And then depending on the domain and the jurisdiction, there are various additional rules that might apply. So in the security setting, there are oftentimes either fiduciary rules or what's called Reg BI, which is close to fiduciary, but those of you who are really securities people will know that there are complex differences between the rules under Reg BI and the fiduciary rules, and those rules apply differently depending on whether you're a broker or an investment advisor. But at the end of the day, the rules are focused on the humans. And to the extent someone is deploying a robo-advisor, they're focused on the entity or the humans who deploy that system. So generally there are, and there have long been, robo-advisors that use automated technologies to help give you financial advice, right? Like one popular platform that I've actually used is Betterment, right? And the way Betterment will work is that you'll sign up, it will take you through a bunch of prompts, and then it will suggest some investments for you. Now that is regulated as an investment advisor under the by the SEC, but there are not a lot of specific rules, as this suggests, regarding how that platform ought to function versus the humans who apply for it. Who actually operated, excuse me. And what the SEC actually found a couple of years ago when it did this investigation of robo-advisors like Schwab, like Betterment, is widespread compliance failures. Failures to do basic things that you would expect any human to selling advice in this way, or providing advice in this way, to supply. So, for instance, there were not audits to make sure that they were actually functioning as intended. They often were giving incorrect advice. They were often actually selling products that were higher margin, but not in the interest of consumers. And of course, any investment advisor is supposed to act as a fiduciary and therefore not elevate its interests above consumers, and also have a duty of due diligence. So in the one domain where we actually have some research about how this has developed, and these are robo-advisors that are not using generative AI, but just sort of using more conventional tools to offer automated advice, we see widespread compliance failures. And that is the best case scenario, right? So actually in insurance, there's really not any investigation whatsoever or monitoring of online platforms as distinct from the entities that deploy these platforms. And so we really don't know anything about the tools that are out there and the special rules that apply. And by and large, that's true of credit-related products as well, though the CFPB was starting to act on this. Now, I should say that the SEC had put forward a proposed rule late in the Biden administration that would have created a range of principles applicable to the use of a broad swath of technology, including AI, and that would have created a lot of rules to try to limit conflicts of interest. I'm sure you can all imagine what the state of that role is right now. Actually, interestingly enough, I'm not entirely sure myself. The SEC is having a meeting in a few weeks on this very topic, but I think that there's a tremendous amount of skepticism that the SEC's rule is actually going to be promulgated. It was a proposed rule and it never actually got moved forward. Of course, the CFPB has been gutted in the last few weeks, and so I'd be very surprised if the CFPB was going to be focusing on this anytime soon. So the bottom line is there's really not very much regulation at all in the US system if you think about it from the side of the financial regulators who are regulating financial advice. All right, well, what about AI regulation? Well, there are, another sort of source of potential regulation here might not come from financial regulators. It might come from the regulation of AI systems. And in fact, in the EU, the EU passed the AI Act about a year ago at this point. And the AI Act, though it's not specific to financial advice, does have various provisions in it that might apply to robo-advisors. So the paper goes through this in some detail, but the bottom line is it prohibits manipulative and deceptive AI practices. And so you could certainly imagine in some scenario where a EU regulator decided that the type of technology that I showed you was manipulative or deceptive. And by the way, there are particular prohibitions if they're exploiting vulnerabilities. So you can imagine that if these tools were deployed to actually go after folks who maybe are easy targets For financial fraud, oftentimes the elderly are targeted for these types of schemes, that would be prohibited by the EU AI Act. And then the way that the AI Act works is it sort of these different buckets for high risk, medium risk, low risk AI applications. And one of the high risk applications is indeed any AI system that mediates the availability of financial services. So presumably, if this were deployed in the EU, it would be considered a high-risk AI application, and that then would trigger this entire regime of oversight and auditing. Now, if I'm describing this at a high level of generality, that's because there are no more details, right? All of these broad principles are in the EU AI Act, and they have not actually been implemented yet. So we don't actually know whether or not or how robo-advisors that are deployed by folks in the EU would fall within these different different areas. We don't know the specific rules. We have broad principles about the auditing that would have to happen, but at the end of the day, this is still in the implementation phase, and so we don't know how it's going to apply. Of course, in the United States, we don't have an AI Act. And while it is the case that the Biden administration did put out an executive order on AI, one of the very first acts of the Trump administration was to rescind that executive order. So right now, there's not really any AI-oriented rules that apply in the US. And in the EU, there are, but they're under development, and we just don't know where they're going to be. So the bottom line is that even though this is an incredibly both promising technology, but an incredibly risky technology, we have basically no rules regarding how these things are regulated in the US. And while we have a process for creating those rules in the EU, that process is very much still underway and uncertain. So that's where we come in, right? So our intervention here say, well, how should we think about regulating this type of technology and this type of risk? And if you are a believer that the risks that I've described to you are real, this should be a pretty important question. So here is what we propose. What we suggest is that there should be essentially a prohibition on using generative AI to match consumers with financial products if there's not a human in the loop, unless a firm first gets a license. And we actually initially had it as sort of a ban entirely, and then we decided to move it to a licensing requirement. That being said, and I'll talk about this in a bit, we don't actually anticipate that a lot of firms would get a license. Who would grant the license? It would be the sectoral regulator. So if you're a banking entity, you have a robo-advisor that you're deploying that is providing banking-related advice or selling credit-related items, you'd have to get a license from your pre-existing regulator. Same thing with insurers, same things with security firms. So how do we think about this? Why do we think this is a good, and let me actually say a few more things about this before I sort of explain why we settled on this as being sort of the best intervention out there. The first thing to say is that this would not apply if there were a human that was using this tool as a support, right? And actually, that is how many of these tools are already being used or have been used in the past, right? You have a human that plugs in information that they get from a customer, and then boom, the tool pops up a suggestion, and then the human says, here's this great suggestion. We don't think that we should be regulating the use of generative AI in this context differently than we regulate other things. And at the end of the day, we've had a regime that regulates the human advisors and the firms that works reasonably well. And we think that there's a lot of potential here for generative AI to help things. So we don't want to create a system where we're inadvertently making it harder for people to give financial advice by making it harder for them to use generative AI systems. So this would not be applicable at all if a human was using this tool. Instead, our proposal is focused entirely on fully automated advice. Moreover, our proposal would not apply to the use of generative AI for any purpose other than matching consumers with products. So if you build a system that, for instance, has a chatbot that answers questions about a product that you've already have, or that gives you advice about servicing the product, or gives you information about servicing the product, or that gets information from you, none of that would be subject to a licensing requirement. The requirement would only kick in if you're actually using generative AI to say, here are your characteristics. Based on those characteristics, here's the financial product that we think is suitable or applicable for you. Okay, so that's the basic proposal. And by the way, we do sort of admit that there are some definitional issues there, right? Like, how would you define product matching purposes? Clearly, there could be some play in the joints there. We don't think, though, that that's any different than any other sort of distinctions that exist in the existing financial regulatory landscape regarding the implementation of rules. So while we admit that there are difficulties there, and while we don't sort of provide a precise statutory definition, we think that it's pretty, we don't think that that's sort of a unreasonable element of our proposal, just something that we'd have to work out if we moved forward. Okay, so why? What's the rationale here? So the first thing to recognize here is that it's actually already the case that most non-generative, that most of the time you can actually give pretty darn good financial advice to people based on pretty sort of symbolic rules, clear rules, right? And you don't actually need generative AI to figure out, you need life insurance, or you need health insurance with a higher deductible or a lower deductible, or you need a homeowner's policy that has this or that, right? Most forms of consumer financial advice are relatively formulaic in terms of the types of products that are appropriate for you and sensible for you given your needs. And in fact, we have all these robo-advisors that are out there that mostly use symbolic AI already. And that's how Betterment works. That's how all of these insurance exchange tools work, right? Where you put in information and it will give you some advice. Tom actually was involved in actually creating a robo-advisor in the health insurance space that he then sold off, right? So it's not a mystery how to figure out what type of financial advice people need for the most part. Now, that's not to say that AI can never be helpful. And there are times in which what you might think of as predictive machine learning AI can be very helpful. So what predictive machine learning AI does is it makes some assessment of your future needs based upon machine learning techniques, right? So in the health insurance space, that might mean something like predicting what type of drugs you might need in the future, or what types of medical services you might need. And AI tools that rely on machine learning can actually be very effective in that regard. So we're also not actually intending to regulate that. But once you get to generative AI, where the goal is not just to predict some specific deterministic figure, but instead to produce human-sounding text or human-sounding voice or human video, that's where we see, frankly, very little potential with respect to matching people to products. Now, to be clear, as I mentioned early on, I do think this is a transformational technology in terms of its capacity to provide good advice to people. Why? Well, it turns out that like about 5 or 10 years ago, everyone was obsessed with robo-advisors. Everyone thought that robo-advisors were going to be you're going to replace human financial advisors. They'd be like travel agents, right? No one goes to a travel agent anymore. And that didn't really happen. As I alluded to earlier, it's still the case that most humans most people use humans to get their financial advice, and robo-advisors are by and large used by those financial advisors on the back end in a way that's not transparent to people. It is true that some robo-advisors have gotten market share, right? Like the Betterments of the world, but they haven't really taken off. Why? The big reason is because people don't trust it, because people need to be sold. People need that human feed. There's that old saying, right? Like and I'm going to butcher right now, but like insurance doesn't sell itself, right? Like you need someone to, I'm messing up the saying, whatever it is, right? You need someone, there's a reason why the sort of paradigmatic salesperson is a life insurance salesperson, right? You need someone to explain it to you and to put it in terms that are resonant. And so the big obstacle with why robo-advisors haven't gotten as much ground as a lot of people expected is because it's missing that human touch. That's where I think, and that's where we think AI has this huge potential, and we don't want to sort of limit that potential. But once it comes to actually saying, but this is the actual recommendation I'm going to make, frankly, generative AI doesn't offer much in terms of benefit. Meanwhile, there are obviously massive costs, right? Sold and not bought. Peter reminded me of the saying, right? Life insurance is sold and not bought. So on the one hand, we think that there's really very little potential benefit for generative AI that we can think of in most sort of settings where you're getting consumer financial advice relative to older technologies. But on the other hand, we think that the risks are massive of using these tools, partially for the reasons that I just described about the sort of fact that you have scale here, you have the capacity to persuade and manipulate in a way that can be super personalized, but also because it's actually really hard to regulate generative AI to the extent it is actually manipulating people. And there are a number of reasons for that, but probably the most intuitive one is that when you're dealing with generative AI, it has this sort of familiar black box feature to it, right? Now, this term gets thrown out a lot, but what it basically means is that the way generative AI works is a complete mystery to most people, right? We don't actually know how it is mechanistically that when I ask the AI a question, it gives me an answer, right? The way that we actually create these tools is by essentially creating this technology and training it on lots of data. And eventually over time, it develops these skills based on that data and based on algorithms that sort of nudge it in the right direction over time. But we really don't understand why it's producing the advice that it does. And that means it's really hard to know why it is that it's making certain recommendations of certain products over other products, which means it's very hard to regulate it. It's very hard to say, oh, well, the reason why it's suggesting financial product Z, for instance, is because the commission is higher, as opposed to some other more legitimate factor that we might say is legitimate to take into account. So the black box nature of this technology means it's really hard to regulate whether or not we have sort of the familiar problems with consumer financial advice of steering to high margin products, of selling products that are not suitable. And that is true because not only is it very hard to know how the technology is working, but it's also quite hard to audit the technology in a way that because it doesn't always produce the exact same results each time you try it. So you could give it you could say, well, before you deploy this, let's test it out on a few sample cases and give a few sample cases and say, oh, well, it looks like it's performing well. But then that doesn't actually mean that it's going to perform well in other cases once it's deployed, particularly if those cases don't resemble the training data that it was trained on or the potential sort of cases that it was trained on. By contrast, actually, one of the real benefits of robo-advisors that use symbolic technology rules to match people with products is that they're super easy for regulators to audit and to understand and to make sure that they are performing adequately. So that's actually a real benefit of robo-advisors, right? Unlike humans, which don't always act in the same way each time, which have all sorts of opaque motivations, which manipulate in ways that aren't always. Robo-advisors are actually easy, at least if they're using symbolic AI, or even if they're using predictive machine learning, where they're trying to predict a specific data point, to say, well, look, explain to me why it is that for this case it's making this recommendation. And explain to me how you came up with that algorithm where you recommend this product for this set of people. Whereas symbolic AI and sort of machine learning AI is relatively easy for regulators to make sure that it's not transgressing ordinary rules of consumer financial protection, the opposite is the true for generative AI. So when we put this all together, right, the bottom line for us is, well, look, the real risks are with product matching. That's not where the real benefits are of this technology. Um, we cannot really easily regulate the product matching feature of this technology, but we can really easily regulate effectively and at relatively low cost the product matching element of more traditional robo-advisors. And so generally, we want to be very skeptical of allowing it. Now, we ultimately went from a ban to a licensing requirement because our thinking is that, look, are there going to be cases where we're wrong? Potentially, right? Maybe there are certain cases where a firm, for instance, has a good way of auditing its technology. We are making advances in understanding how certain AIs make predictions, and so that's one thing that could change. Another thing that could change is maybe we're wrong that symbolic AI is always just as good as generative AI or symbolic rules when it comes to consumer financial product recommendations. Maybe there are certain contexts in which that's not accurate. Maybe there are new types of financial products that where it's really hard to come up with clear rules about who should buy what. And so we want to allow for a setting in which, when those conditions are met, a firm could go to its regulator and say, look, I have an unusual case. Here's my plan. Let's regulate it in that way. But in general, our sense is that because those instances are not likely to occur very often, that we should set the default as you can't do this unless you affirmatively go and get permission from your regulator and convince your regulator that you are going to be able to offer a tool that we can be sure is not going to create these harms and is going to be properly overseen. Now we have another element as well, right? So far I've been talking about anti-regulation, right? How do we regulate this stuff to make sure that it's not a real risk? But we have another element to our proposal, which is, well, what happens when the inevitable reality occurs and someone is duped by a robo-advisor, or someone purchases a product that's not suitable for them, or that violates or that ends up causing them significant harm. And so the rules that apply here are super heterogeneous depending upon the regulatory domain, the jurisdiction, as I alluded to earlier. And so we sort of try to avoid the very well-worn debates about what the standard of care ought to be for financial advisors in terms of fiduciary standards or suitability or what have you. But what we argue is that to the extent you have a robo-advisor of any type, and here we're actually not specific to generative AI, we think any robo-advisor or any fully automated tool that is dispensing financial advice, we then think that we should have a relatively stringent standard of care. We punt a little bit on exactly what that should be because we think that it may differ depending on the jurisdiction and depending on the domain. So for instance, in securities, that would probably be a fiduciary standard, although we think a fiduciary standard would probably be appropriate in the insurance setting. Given that we don't have a fiduciary standard for any insurance product, we're a bit less sort of willing to say, yes, there should be a fiduciary standard here. But the argument is that whatever your most stringent standard is for humans, that should apply to fully automated advice, and potentially you should go beyond that. Now, why do we make that argument? There are really a few key components of our argument, and I'm not going to sort of belabor them. But first, obviously, we think that there are big risks of exploitation, and having a relatively stringent standard of care helps limit those risks. Now, that's true in any setting, right? That's not an argument that's specific to robo-advisors. But what we argue is that many of the best arguments against that proposal when it comes to humans don't actually apply when it comes to robo-advisors. So the first thing is the marginal cost of providing this advice is basically zero, right? And one of the big arguments against sort of stringent standards of care, fiduciary standards of care when it comes to humans is that you're going to reduce the availability of financial advice because you're going to increase the costs of supplying that advice. And while you may or may not buy that in the context of human financial advice, we think that is a much less compelling argument when it comes to automated advice, again, because the marginal cost is zero. Now, that doesn't mean that in theory you might not deter some entrance into the marketplace, because that is possible. But we think that given the economies at work here, it's unlikely that the fact that there's a higher standard of care is going to significantly reduce access to these tools. The other piece of it, and I think this in some ways may even be more important, is one of the things that's really tricky with humans is just like figuring out what happened, right? Having an evidentiary record that is reliable, that tells us exactly what was communicated in these human interactions. Well, one of the great things about robo-advisors is all of it is automated, all of it's online, and all of it's recorded. And so you have a complete evidentiary record of exactly what happened. And that then means that figuring out how to apply a more stringent standard of care is easier. So at the end of the day, I'm going to sort of try to wrap up here, see if we can get some conversation going, right? You know, our real goal is to balance innovation and consumer protection. We think that if you don't have any consumer protection and you say, look, let the market go wild, there are just massive risks. And my sense, and I guess this is hard to substantiate, is that with those, if those risks really proliferate, that's going to undermine the ability of this technology to flourish. Because who's going to trust some set of tools when it's sort of common knowledge that people get duped all the time by these tools? And so having a regime that limits the biggest risks of this technology, but also at the same time fosters a innovation is the goal. And we are thinking that we're trying obviously to hit that sweet spot. There are, of course, massive uncertainties in our sort of article and our proposal that I can't answer fully, but I'm happy to discuss. So one thing is, like, what would the licensing requirements be for a regulator, and when would a regulator actually be able to license one of these technologies and then effectively regulate it? That's tough because these regulators really are outgunned by firms out there, and it's very hard, as I alluded to earlier, to ensure that these tools are being used effectively. We would hope that a regulator didn't have the expertise or the confidence that it could effectively or regulate these tools and ensure that they weren't being misused, wouldn't actually grant a license. But of course, that is hard to say. And there are questions like, regulatory capture. There are all sorts of times where regulators are convinced to give licenses to things that then blow up. And at the end of the day, all we can do is try to limit that risk by having better personnel. And maybe that's not realistic. There are all sorts of questions about how we define different pieces of our proposal. How do you distinguish generative AI versus predictive machine learning AI, for instance? That is not always as easy as it may seem. And in some ways, generative AI is actually just a prediction of the next token or the next, at least with a chat bot. So there would certainly be line drawing problems. Similar to the product matching piece. And again, our view is, yes, there are line drawing problems, but we could draw these lines where it's reasonably clear most of the time which side of the line you fall on, even if there are individual cases where it's a tough call and we'd have to sort of develop precedent over time. There are also just real questions about how you would implement this system given the fragmented nature of financial regulation, both across jurisdictions and across individual sectors. And we, to some extent, try to accommodate that with our ex post regime. But certain even with the licensing idea, that's going to work better in some settings than others. Maybe we'd have more confidence that the SEC would grant licenses well than that state insurance regulators will. Maybe in the context of state insurance regulation, we'd be very concerned that one state would grant licenses and another wouldn't, and that would then create some race to the bottom. So there are massive complexities that we can't fully work out because of the level of generality at which the article is pitched. But we hope that the article sort of offers a good framework for addressing what we think of as both this real potential for this technology to reshape the landscape of consumer financial advice, and to at the same time limit some of the very real risks that we see being created by these tools. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll see if I can do that. And I'd love to have a conversation with all of you.
Thank you very much, Dan. So I will keep the queue. Please raise your hand or chat some question to me if you have one. And Travis has the honor of going first. There's a lot to talk about here, but yeah, thanks.
So fascinating paper. Thank you. I have all kinds of thoughts, but one excites me the most because I think I know what the next paper should be.
Oh,
And
great.
The title should be robo-regulators, right? And so it made me think about this because you can imagine that a lot of the problems that Gen AI would produce on the sort of robo-regulator side could be addressed, or at least the regulatory difficulties could be mitigated by allowing the regulators to use Gen AI too. So like you could imagine them using it in auditing, in all the different very costly aspects of licensing that require a ton of expensive expertise. You could have far less trained people leveraging Gen AI to do those things. And so I can't think through all the implications of this, but there's a sort of asymmetry in the paper where the Gen AI produces all the problems, but it might also produce some of the the poison might beget the cure, and so it seems like there's a lot of interesting things to flesh out there in terms of how regulators could leverage it to solve it. And but the sort of adversarial, like Gen AI adversarial thing could also, you could imagine consumers leveraging their own little chat GPT agent to vet the robo advisors, to check the sources and right, like a kind of adversarial. Anyway, so that dynamic I think would be super interesting to explore in future work.
I love it. I mean, so some of you may know, I've been doing a lot of work on just like the use of AI in lawyering, and I'm also thinking about it a lot in the context of education. And one of the things is your suggestion reminds me of a little bit is sort of the concern that students submit their papers using Gen AI, then instructors use Gen AI to like grade it, and it's sort of like just Gen AI, AI is talking to one another, and it's sort of a similar thing here. I absolutely, and I mean, for better or worse, one of the things that the Doge unit and Elon Musk is trying to do is use AI more in government services and regulation. I do absolutely think that these tools are, that Gen AI is a potentially really important tool for regulators. Actually, one element that I think is particularly promising. And actually, we're going to be, I guess now is a good time I should promote the conference we're having in May, where we're having a conference on AI and insurance law and regulation at UConn in person with a lot of great people. One of the people we're having started a company that uses Gen AI to help people fight denials of health insurance claims. So there are a lot of different ways of using this technology for regulating, for empowering consumers. The tricky thing, though, is that in some ways, this technology could be used to say, sort of disarm consumers into thinking that they're already getting what you're describing here, right? This tool. And it's hard. I mean, imagine a regulator is sort of trying to Well, I don't know. I need to think about it more, but I think you're right. At least like if a regulator were like going to grant a license, right? It may it may say, well, one of the things you have to do is have a separate AI system that's double checking what you're doing and reporting back to us any potential concerning products. So yeah, I think it's a great idea. You know, obviously don't have like really well developed ideas there, but the basic point I want to emphasize is, yeah, where it's already the case that regulators and at least government services are thinking about how to deploy AI effectively to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of their services and regulation. So yes.
Great. Dan, can I just ask a quick follow-up before I'll cut in
Yeah.
before Alex, but this is quick. So you were skeptical about audits because you claimed, you said that Gen AIs don't necessarily yield consistent results, so that the same query can produce a different answer each time.
Yeah.
It seems to me that just knock that up a level. That's not really a problem. This is, as you said, a zero marginal cost world. So you submit millions of queries to it, and then you can just look at the average of all those. And you do that in computer time that doesn't cost anything really at all. So you just bombard it with a bunch of stuff, and you can get a picture of how it's going to react, you know, across the distribution of questions that it might get, even if it's not consistent, you know, answers to any one. It's not a human, so we don't care about that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think my pushback to that would be, so here what we're talking about in particular, or concerned about in particular, is the concern that part of what you would do sort of with an audit. So with an audit, you do both ex ante and ex post, right? So before you deploy it, you sort of give it lots of scenarios and see, is it working the way that you think it should be working? And your point is, well, you wouldn't just sort of give it one scenario, you give it millions of scenarios and make sure that on average it's working reasonably well. And I think that's right. The difficulty, though, is that what you can't know is, well, is it the case that once it gets this type of situation, it's going to start doing something that's really unpredictable or different? And in particular, if that situation is not well reflected it's not well reflected in the training data, it may pretty systematically give terrible advice to a certain subset of people, and that's not within your millions of scenarios that you gave it, right? So the millions of scenarios you gave it have to be representative of all of the millions of scenarios it would actually get. And that's hard to do, right? You may not actually know or be able to predict, in this XYZ scenario, it's going to go off the rails. It's going to start hallucinating. It's going to start making recommendations that are really troubling. And so I think that's part of the problem. The other thing, and Rick said this in the comments, and I think he's right. Like, even if it's working well on average, that doesn't necessarily mean that that it's not going to cause some harm. And I suppose we might say, well, look, we should tolerate some harm if it's a lot less than the harm that a human would produce, right? And that is actually one of the standards we suggest for licensing, that a firm would have to show to the regulator or prove to the regulator that on average, the advice that it gives is better in terms of the fidelity to the interests of the consumer than the advice that actual humans give. But that, I think, is hard to do, even if you're giving it sort of millions of data points ex ante.
Great. Okay, so Alex was next, and then Bob Yass, and then Rich Bedlaw.
Hi, excuse me. This is super interesting, and I think maybe my question is a little bit addressed by something that you just said at the end of your last response. But I guess what I wanted to know is if there's maybe a way to be more surgical about evaluating the outcomes of the advice that the AI gives you, rather than the mere fact that the AI is giving the advice in the first place. And the reason I thought of that is that I am also a Betterment customer, and I sort of signed up in the heady early days of robo-advisors, when there was sort of the idea behind it was, this is going to be better than interacting with a human, because the human, there's not going to be a 25-year-old who will earn a fat commission if they convince you to buy some security that somebody's going to get a kickback for. And so cutting the human out of it in a way cuts out the sort of conflict of interest that would exist. And so, why doesn't the same thing apply for the AI? I was sort of convinced by some of what you said, that's, it's still troubling and concerning that maybe doesn't solve the problem. But then I sort of come back to, well, if the generative AI is convincing everyone to buy, zero cost Vanguard index funds, isn't that, a good outcome for the world? And shouldn't that be like all we care about?
Yeah, but the thing is, some products, it's hard to know in the abstract whether advice is good or bad, right? And so you can certainly sort of say, look, we don't care about how. So if I understand your question, like sometimes we don't care about how it got to the answer, right? We care about, is the advice good advice or bad advice? And maybe we can evaluate that objectively without knowing how the AI is working. So am I understanding your question right then? That like
Yeah.
in some ways it doesn't matter that it's a black box, because all we care about is input and output. And so if we can measure input and we can measure output, we're good. I think there are some difficulties with that, though I will say this. I basically think that that is potentially right, and that's why licensing is plausible, right? So if there is a regulator that is convinced it can do that at scale and convinced that, yes, it can easily decide whether or not unsuitable products are being recommended, or no, this is recommending, making recommendations that are pretty objectively reasonable, and doing so in a way that promotes. Then that's part of what we would hope a regulator would take into account in approving a license. And so, in some ways, I think your point is a reasonable one, and one reason why we want a regulator to have that authority in appropriate cases. But there are going to be a lot of cases in which it's not as simple as being like, oh yes, this advice always can be good, right? Like, what if it's some product that has a fat commission, but is actually a great product for some subset of people, and our challenge is going to be figure out whether or not the AI is recommending it to the right people or not. That might be a really hard thing to audit if you don't know exactly how it's making the calculation of which people get that recommendation versus some other recommendation. So bottom line, I think I basically agree with you, but we want to make sure that a regulator is ensuring that what you described is in fact happening. And that is, I think, one of the main criteria that a regulator would use in granting a license, hopefully.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Dan, so I know you said you had to leave at 5 promptly. Maybe we have time for one more. Bob, yes, you want to go?
Quick question. So Dan, and you may have alluded to this in the paper, we'll have to get to that, but not surprisingly, question coming from me would be not only this being a force for potential fraud, but a force for potential discrimination. And is that, it's sort of duh, of course it would deal with that, but I'm wondering if you've pondered that.
Yeah, no, I think that that is absolutely right. One of the things that's a little challenging is one of the biggest risks with financial advice really is this concern about self-serving advice, and you tend to see less emphasis on discrimination as a regulatory concern with the provision of consumer financial advice, but it can absolutely happen. So to take a really, I think, good example, right? A lot of low-income people were sold subprime loans in the leading up to 2008 when they actually qualified for prime loans, and I think there was some discrimination there, where there was a sense of like, this person is the type of person who should be given a subprime loan, where they won't understand that a subprime loan is not in their interest, or and so I do think that that is a concern. To some extent, if you're confident that it's giving good consumer financial advice, then I think the discrimination concern decreases. But I think you're absolutely right that that is a concern. So bottom line again, we'd want a regulator, right, to be making sure that it's dispensing, that if it's granting a license, it's only doing so in scenarios where it's confident that harm isn't coming to fruition. Whether or not it could prevent that harm simply by focusing on the quality of the advice, or it should sort of separately conceptualize discrimination as an independent harm that's elevated with generative AI? I don't know. It's a good question.
Okay, well, there are lots more good questions, but we don't have time for them, unfortunately. Dan, come back and talk to us after you write the second and third paper in this series. And thanks for joining us this time.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Bye, everybody. See you in 2 weeks.